Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig. For our topic this week, we turn to the newly created United States. The American Revolution has ended. Now comes perhaps the task even more difficult than acquiring independence: how to bind a nation of 13 separate states together, with all of their diverging economic interests and class struggles. How do you actually create a nation? How do you govern that nation? And is it possible to do all of this and still live up to the revolutionary and democratic language that gave color and spirit to the movement for independence? We shall see, friends. After declaring independence, American political leaders created new constitutions and declarations of rights that articulated the role of the state and federal governments while protecting individual liberties and limiting both centralized power and excessive popular influence. Notice I said constitutions in plural. All 13 states immediately drafted their own state constitutions after independence was declared. Further, colonial leaders implemented a federal plan for a national government called the Articles of Confederation, which after a tumultuous decade would be replaced by the Federal Constitution in 1788. What makes all this fascinating was the political dance leaders engaged in. The promise of protecting individual liberties would be key, as well as creating a central government that would be limited in its power. And behind all of this, we see a very important goal of the political elite: how to ensure that there wouldn't be too much democracy, and calls for economic redistribution. Above all, how could political leaders protect their own property and status and limit the democratic aspirations of the masses? The Articles of Confederation unified the newly independent states, creating a central government with limited power. It was adopted and tried to unite the 13 colonies under one governance structure during the War for Independence. By design, the 13 states were grouped loosely into this confederation. Perhaps the most important accomplishment of the government under the Articles was the passage of the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, which created stipulations for how the Northwestern territories would be incorporated later into the United States. Most importantly, the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the region north of the Ohio River. The Articles of Confederation was meant to create a system where the power of the central federal government would be limited. Very limited. Thus, each state would retain a great deal of sovereignty. But this structure both created and failed to deal with a number of political and economic issues. So much so that the elite of the new states would later meet in secret to revise the Articles of Confederation. Under these articles, there was no executive. Congress was unable to legislate effectively, and no revenue could be raised since the central government lacked the power to issue taxes. In the years after the American Revolution, difficulties over trade, finances, and internal unrest led to calls for a stronger central government. The straw that broke the Articles' back was a mass rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion in 1787. Shays' Rebellion was an armed uprising in western Massachusetts in opposition to a debt crisis among the citizens and the state government's increased efforts to collect taxes on the individuals. Farmers who were unable to pay their taxes would see their farms taken from them. Foreclosures were ordered by the local courthouses. So the angry farmers organized, rose up, armed themselves, and occupied the courthouses. No courts, no foreclosures. The rebellion ultimately was unsuccessful as local and outside militias marched against the farmers. But to the elite who led the revolution, their panic erupted. Was the nation they had fought to create about to fall apart at the seams? Had the absence of a strong central government in the United States, such as could be found in Britain, left a dangerous vacuum where the wealthy and powerful had no legal and political protection from the angry masses? Something had to be done. The Constitutional Convention met in secret in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. At first, The plan was to simply revise the Articles of Confederation. Quickly, though, the delegates realized they had to abandon the Articles completely and create a plan for a much stronger central government that could better protect private property and protect the elites themselves from too much democracy from below. 55 elites from 12 of the 13 states attended the convention. Almost half owned slaves. George Washington was selected to preside over the convention. The oldest delegate there was Benjamin Franklin. However, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were to be the most influential members during the convention. The federal constitution the framers drafted would be the opposite of the Articles of Confederation. Whereas the Articles were designed to allow states to retain a great deal of sovereignty and keep the federal government weak, the Constitution was meant to create a strong central government that would be more powerful than the states. The Constitution would be the supreme law of the land, meaning no state could enact legislation that contradicted the Constitution. The federal government was divided into 3 branches: the legislative branch, Congress, the executive branch, the presidency, and the judicial branch, the federal court system. A system of checks and balances between the branches were designed so that no one branch could dominate the others. Interestingly, the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution, and yet the Constitution clearly protects the American system of slavery. The Constitution protects property, and since enslaved people were considered property, slyly, slavery would continue. Also slyly, the Fugitive Slave Clause appears, stating that property that transports itself across state lines shall be returned. What kind of property can transport itself? They're talking about enslaved people. Another dubious clause is a 3/5 compromise, where southern states could count 3/5 of their enslaved people called, quote, other persons in the Constitution, to determine their state's population. This matters greatly because the higher your state's population, the more representatives your state gets to send to Congress. Finally, the Constitution also states that a certain Atlantic trade, the Atlantic slave trade, shall end in 20 years, in 1808. This does not end slavery. It only ends the legal importation of further enslaved peoples from Africa. What this does is to greatly increase the value of enslaved people already in the U.S., making the rich slave owners even richer. Now, how does this plan, written by elites in hiding from the people, actually become the supreme law of the land? The process called for a period of readings and debates across the U.S. Each state would set a date from late 1787 to early 1788 for a ratification convention. The upper classes of each state would be able to attend the convention. If 9 out of the 13 states approved the Constitution at their conventions, then the Constitution would be ratified. The debates were fierce. Federalists like Alexander Hamilton supported ratification. Anti-Federalists opposed ratification. They feared the power of this new federal central government and the loss of autonomy for each state. Federalists were able to win because they ensured the ratification of the Constitution by promising the addition of a Bill of Rights that enumerated individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of Congress, of the federal government. So now, let's end by reflecting on change during the constitutional era. The Articles of Confederation failed to keep the 13 states solidly united and offered no solutions to terrible economic slumps that states found themselves in after the Revolution. In order to revive the economy, to create a strong central government, and to protect the interests of the elite from the demands of the masses, a new framework for government was drafted. The Constitution became the supreme law of the land in 1788. In this phase of the perpetual struggle between aristocracy and democracy, the aristocracy clearly won.